In this lesson, we're going to learn about the trig functions on the unit circle. And what we want to do is we want to consider an x and y axis, and we want to draw a circle on this axis. And then we want to focus on the first quadrant. We're going to pick a point on the circle. We're going to draw our radius. We're going to come straight down, 90-degree angle. And this is theta. This is the reference angle theta. Well, this point is composed of x and y. And we know that x is greater than 0 and y is greater than 0. That means they're both positive. Well, how did we get this point? We went from the center, we moved to the right x distance, and then we went up y distance. So we can literally say that this triangle has an adjacent side of x, an opposite side of y, and a hypotenuse of r. Now we can write our trig functions. Sine theta would be opposite of our adjacent, y over r. The reciprocal is going to be r over y. Cosine theta, which is adjacent over hypotenuse, is going to be x over r. The reciprocal is going to be r over x. Tangent theta is opposite over adjacent, or y over x. The reciprocal is going to be x over y. And what we want to consider now is, what are the signs of our trig functions, or do the signs of the trig functions or the trig ratios change when you change the quadrant? And the answer is yes. We know that in quadrant 1, both the x and the y are positive, and the radius is always going to be positive, right? R equals 1 on the unit circle. R equals the square root of x squared plus y squared. And r is always greater than 0. Well, consider the sign. The sign is y over r. Well, y is positive, r is positive, right? I'm going to do the work over here so you can kind of see it. It's y over r. Well, if y is positive and r is positive, right, then the whole thing is going to be greater than 0. So it's going to be a positive number. And if the sine is positive, so is the cosecant. Okay? The cosine is x over r. Well, if x is positive and r is positive, the whole thing is positive. So the cosine and the secant are positive. The same thing goes for the tangent, which is y over x. Y is positive, x is positive, so it is positive along with its reciprocal. Now let's look at the second quadrant. We're going to draw a point over here, and this is going to be an x and y value. And I hope you can see that because we are in the second quadrant and we went to the left, the x distance is going to be negative. So in the second quadrant, x is less than 0, but y is a positive value. Y is going to be positive. Okay? Yeah, we can put a little negative sign here just to remind ourselves that x is going to be negative. And we can do the same consideration when you can think about the second quadrant. Is the sign going to be positive? Well, sign is y over r in the second quadrant. Y is positive, r is positive, so the sign is positive. The sine and the cosecant are going to be positive. Cosine. Cosine is x over r. Well, the x happens to be negative in our second quadrant, and so is r. So the cosine and its reciprocal are going to be negative. The tangent is y over x. The x is negative, so it's going to make the tangent negative. So we did this exercise. We did it also in the third quadrant. Drew a point. And in this time, we found that y is also going to be negative. X is less than 0, and both y is, not greater than, less than 0 on the third quadrant. Radius is always positive. And then we looked at our trig functions. What about the sine? Sine is y over r. Y is negative, so the sine is negative. So is the reciprocal. Cosine. Cosine is x over r. X is negative in the third quadrant, so the cosine and the secant are negative. Tangent, though, is y over x. Y is negative, x is negative, so the ratio is going to be positive. And in the fourth quadrant, we can go through the same study like this. In this case, the x is positive and the y is going to be negative. And in the fourth quadrant, we found that the sine and the cosecant were negative. The cosine and the secant were negative. Wait. This one was positive, and the tangent and the cotangent were negative. And in order to remember all this information, we learned the mnemonic of all students take calculus. All students take calculus. And what this tells us is that all the functions are positive. The sine and its reciprocal is positive. The tangent and its reciprocal is positive. The cosine and its reciprocal is positive. And that's what that stands for. Then we learned how to use that information. Alright, let's see. Some of the other things that we learned was, if you are given a point 8, negative 6 on a circle, find the exact value. Of all trig functions. Okay. Alright, so we know the point in the circle. So it's going to be 8, negative 6. So we go 8 this way. We go negative 6 down. So we draw the triangle like this in the fourth quadrant, and we're missing the radius essentially. But we can find the radius. The radius is the square root of 8 squared plus negative 6 squared. We find that our radius is going to be 10. So now we know the radius, and we have all the pieces that we need to write our trig functions. Well, we know the sine theta is going to be the opposite over the adjacent, or the y over the r. So it's negative 6 over 10, which is negative 3 over 5. The cosecant is just the reciprocal, so negative 5 over 3. Cosine theta is going to be the adjacent over the hypotenuse, or x over the hypotenuse. That's 8 over 10, which is going to reduce to 4 over 5. Its reciprocal secant is then going to be 5 over 4. We just flip the number. We flip. Tangent theta is going to be opposite over adjacent. So in this case it's negative 6 over 8, or negative 3/4. And the reciprocal is going to be negative 4 over 3. Okay. Right. Something else that we learned was our unit circle. Our unit circle has very important angles, the quadrantal angles. This is 0 degrees. It's also 360 degrees. I guess we can put it in radians as well. 0 radians, 2 pi radians. This one is 90 degrees, or also known as pi halves. This is 180 degrees, also known as pi. This one's 270 degrees, also known as 3/2 pi. And we know that the unit circle means that the radius is 1. Okay? So that means that this point right here is 1, 0. This point right here on the unit circle is 0, 1. This point over here is negative 1, 0. And this point over here happens to be 0, -1. This gives us a lot of information about the sine and the cosine, because essentially, if you think about it, cosine of theta is x over r. Well, if r equals 1, this is essentially the x value. And the sine of theta is y over r. And if r is 1, then it just equals y. So literally, you can think of those points as cosine theta, sine theta. Okay. X being cosine, y being sine. So if somebody were to ask you, let's say, for the sine of negative 180 degrees, all you have to do is, number one, change negative 180 to an angle between 0 and 360. So negative 180 plus 360 means positive 180 degrees. So literally you're looking for the sine of 180 degrees. And the sine of 180 is the y value at 180. The y value at 180 happens to be 0 degrees. So you go back to the unit circle. The y value is 0. So the sine of 180 is 0. Pretty neat, right? Number 2. Let's say they want the tangent of 3/2 pi. Well, 3/2 pi happens to be the 270 degree angle. The tangent is the sine, well, let's not go there right now. It's defined as y over x. The y value at 270 happens to be -1. The x value happens to be 0. Now you can't have 0 in the denominator, so this is going to be undefined. Okay? So what you can see is with these private problems, as long as you know the definition in terms of x, y, and r, you can literally just look at the coordinate points on the unit circle and be able to answer these questions. Alright, reference angles. Reference angles are an interesting breed. This you just have to remember. The reference angle in quadrant 1 is the angle. Reference angle over here is 180 minus theta. The reference angle in the third quadrant is theta minus 180. And the reference angle in the last quadrant, quadrant 4, is 360 minus theta. And it's just a game of finding your reference angle. So let's say, for example, they say find the reference angle of 300 degrees. Well, the first thing is you need to know is which quadrant is it in, right? So you think about it, 300, that means it's in quadrant 4. And when you're in quadrant 4, your reference angle is 360 minus the angle in question. So in this case, it's 360 minus 300. And 60 minus 30 is 30. Your reference angle is 30 degrees.